Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amanda Paul, and I'm Deputy Head of the Europe in the World programme at the EPC, where I also lead the work that we do on Ukraine. Welcome to this EPC discussion, which is focused on the battlefield situation in Ukraine, as Ukraine is heading into what seems to be set to be a very difficult winter. This event is part of the EPC's Ukraine programme. We plan to address several burning issues in this discussion and probably many more. First of all, the impact, objectives and results of Ukraine's recent Kursk operation, the situation on the front lines in eastern and southern Ukraine, the military assistance to Ukraine from its partners and the ongoing discussions, particularly with the United States, vis-a-vis the use of long-range missiles to strike deep inside Russia, but also the ongoing discussions with other partners, particularly in the EU, about increasing weapons supplies and doing it much quicker. And to talk about these issues and many more, we have three very good guests with us today. First of all, coming to us from Ukraine, Mykola Bielieskov, who is a senior analyst and fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, otherwise CEPA, but also from the Come Back Alive Foundation in Ukraine, which does really excellent work. Jade McGlynn, who's research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. And last but certainly not least, Major General Gordon Davies, retired. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us today. To the audience, as usual, please put your questions into the chat box or click on the hand icon if you would like to put a question. So I'm going to kick off with a question basically for all of our panelists, quite a broad topic, namely the ongoing reluctance of the US to green light or lift the restrictions on Ukraine using long-range Western missiles to strike military targets deep inside of Russia. So it would be good to hear your views on why you consider President Biden is still not green lighting this. Is it because they really fear escalating with the Russians? Again, this issue of red lines, and we'd hope that the red lines had all disappeared by now. Or is it perhaps because of the upcoming elections and not wanting to give some sort of gift to Trump? Or is it something else? And maybe could you see potentially this happening at the upcoming UN General Assembly, where I understand President Zelensky will be attending? So I'd like to come to you first, Mykola. So I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. First, I want to clarify a little bit about my affiliations, because I've heard about SIPA. I have no relations to SIPA. So I'm research fellow at Ukrainian National Institute for Strategic Studies, which is a think tank attached to the office of the President of Ukraine. So everything I say is my private position, not the official position. And also I have non-governmental affiliation, which is Come Back Alive Charity, as you mentioned, the biggest non-governmental one that is aiding armed forces of Ukraine. We raised more than $300 million since 24th of February 2022. And back to your question with regards to this ongoing debate, I think we've come to the point when the balancing act that Biden administration tried to do since 21st of February 2022 is no longer tenable. So the balancing act is the following one. Biden simultaneously tried to aid Ukrainian self-defense, to ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose, Russia doesn't win, and by this strengthen Ukraine negotiation position, but simultaneously do it in such a way that Russia doesn't have any kind of credible excuse, credible justification to breach nuclear taboo. But now we come to the point when you can't sit on two seats and you need to choose. Because currently, the needs of Ukrainian strategic defensive operation we need to wage, actually to stabilize the front line, to ensure that Russia is not able to move front line by force and accept this. This requirement, this demand can be implemented only through long-range firepower. And it's not only about airfields. I don't know, for whatever reason, we allowed airfields to dominate these debates, because it's never about airfields. It's about the whole infrastructure that allow Russia to generate, sustain, and employ inter-service grouping of forces employed against Ukraine on a front line that is more than 1,000 kilometer of width. So that's my position, and debate is ongoing. And for sure, the so-called victory plan Zelensky announced on 27th of August 2024, and which he wanted to present to both Biden and two nominees of two US parties, is going to feature long-range firepower, because we have here a major general, and I think he's going to prove that Ukraine is asked to wage war US, UK, NATO in general is not going to wage, because current doctrine, prospective doctrine, it's always emphasized range. It's emphasized ability to strike deep, to ease the pressure on the front line. And it is the current requirement Ukraine face. So that's how we see the situation from Kyiv.
Thank you, Mykola. Maybe I can just add on. I mean, are you expecting to get this decision? I mean, anytime soon?
You know,
I mean, are we getting nearer to it?
So it's 31st year of a big war between Ukraine and Russia, and usually the situation with a specific strike capability evolved in a following way. So Biden administration drug feet to the extent possible. But when situation became so precarious, there is no other decision, no other solution, then we have this decision eventually. It happened, for instance, with the strikes near the border in May. So when Russia started another offensive which targeted Kharkiv, and there was a risk that Russians might approach Kharkiv and start to shell it, then we've seen this decision to green light GMLRS strikes of the range 85 kilometers. So I think eventually military logic is going to prevail. The issue when it's going to prevail and how much would it cost in terms of lives, territories, and also conditions at which Ukraine can negotiate, because it's not only about frontline, it's about basically setting conditions, at least some conditions, for negotiations and depriving Russia to ability both to influence territorial settlement, but also other important parameters of settlement. So I believe that military logic will prevail eventually, as it happened before numerous times. The only issue is when it's going to prevail, because finally, if you allow political considerations to prevail instead of balancing political and military consideration, nothing good would happen. And Biden and US still need to pursue this minimalist approach, that Ukraine shouldn't lose, Russia shouldn't win.
Thank you, and sorry for cocking up your name. I think I got your title mixed up with Skipser, so apologize for that. So maybe we can come back to this issue of conditions when Ukraine is able to negotiate a bit later. But I want to give the floor over now to Major Gordon as a representative or a former representative of the U.S. Armed Forces. How you view this issue, and what's your expectation, Major, in the coming weeks on this topic? I mean, is the Americans finally going to give the green light?
So, Mana, this has been a long-standing issue, and as as a former operator, commander, and certainly planner at operational strategic levels, we've all military commanders and analysts and strategists always want the least amount of conditions possible to pursue whatever political objectives have been approved or imposed, et cetera. And in this case, we've seen the Biden administration just be late to need time and time again. And so I can understand the frustration that Mykola expresses and that many have felt. I think also if we look, this year, there's already been some key steps forward, which I think tell us, where the decision is likely headed. As Mykola rightly pointed out, with the Kharkiv incursion by Russia in April, late April, we already saw some lifting of the restrictions on use of allied weapon systems into Russia to relieve pressure on the strikes against Kharkiv and civilian infrastructure, et cetera. Even in the after 6 August, perhaps after the fact, U.S. and allies realized that some of their combat systems and munitions were being used. but there was no objection against HIMARS use, against pontoon bridges and bridging to prevent Russian counteroffensive against the Kursk incursion. So there was another, perhaps soft lifting of restrictions, acceptance of the fact that that was an acceptable use of weapons, combat vehicles, and munitions against Russian targets inside Russia. I can come back to some more strategic implications about that later. But looking at this, the specific discussion of lifting, the restrictions really on ATACMS is what we're talking about. ATACMS and Storm Shadow / Scalp, which is the same thing, the French version of the Storm Shadow, which has U.S. technical components, which is why there's a requirement from U.S. approval for targeting with those systems inside Russian territory. I think that's going to eventually be supported. What we've seen is Biden and his team generally be very, very cautious to date, time and time again, from artillery to tanks to F-16s to long-range missile systems, et cetera. That's been the gradual trend, because I think they've overestimated Putin's likelihood of escalation, and put more credence into his nuclear threats than they deserved. And that's been generally the issue today. So my view is Biden's looking to build a coalition of support. He's got Starmers. He's got about 6 other nations who don't necessarily provide long-range missile systems, but certainly UK and France. And he's probably waiting for just the right timing to ensure that he's got the broadest amount of support publicly and then internationally before he lifts the restrictions. I don't think it's the right thing to do, but I think that eventually will be a positive impact on the battlefield.
But then I guess this would need to be before the US election. So we're basically talking about
I think we're talking
weeks.
this month. Yes, I think we're talking this month, not before, certainly before November.
Okay. That would be very good news indeed. And I'd like to come to you, Jade, on the same issue. You're an expert on let's say on Russia, on the Russian military, on Putin. How would you assess this in the same way as Mykola and Skip? Do you think that this issue of escalation has been really overemphasized in the past, and should we not be concerned at all about the new all of the Russian talk narratives about how using the long-range missiles would really be crossing a red line?
I think that we've seen what happens when Russian red lines are crossed in general. That's not to be completely dismissive. Of course, there has to be some sanity, but and essentially nothing really happens. There will be retaliatory measures. They're very unlikely to be nuclear, certainly for something the current issue that we're talking about. Much more likely to see the sorts of sabotage attacks and other crimes on the soil of NATO countries, and I can understand, of course, why countries would want to avoid that, but it seems rather harsh, and I am biased here since I split my time between the UK and Kharkiv. It seems rather harsh to make Ukrainian civilians pay the cost to avoid that. I agree with everything that Major General Mykola said. I think that we are reaching the end of the functionality of this balancing act that the White House has been pursuing. It's clearly not focused on Ukraine winning, it's focused on not letting Ukraine lose. But I think there's a missing aspect from this strategy, which is to do with the resilience in 2022, because Ukraine society was so incredibly resilient, that then caused a lot of people to recalibrate their understanding. But no society can continue to live under the conditions that in particular the east of the country is living under. It's nothing to do with Ukraine. I mean, in fact, it's completely remarkable they've managed to exist so long. But there are issues with manpower, there's issues with morale, understandably, because if you think that if you're still continuing to live under these conditions of incessant bombing, of Iranian drones, of being terrorized, and bluntly looking at the West and feeling like not really that much is on offer other than just stopping you from entirely bleeding out, it's pretty hard to keep your morale high. So there needs to be a massive shift in strategy. Right now, there's not the political will for that. But these efforts, I mean, Mykola will talk with much more expertise about this than I will, but we also need to be careful that when, and I agree that they are likely, you know, to eventually approve the use, when it does happen, I mean, the UK doesn't even have that many Storm Shadows left. We have real capacity issues. You know, and no one weapon in any case is going to make a difference. The problem is that it's every single weapon system or every single different military move is delayed until such a point where it will not make the impact that it could have made if it had been originally applied. The obvious example here is the F-16s, which are then applied sent with delay and not in the numbers necessary. And I find it almost sometimes quite a remarkable complacency that anybody, you know, that anybody making these decisions in the West, and I know many of them don't, but anybody making these decisions in the West could think that the end situation for this is going to be anything but Ukraine eventually bleeding out. And if that's not what Western countries want to happen, and I certainly think it's in our security interests that it doesn't happen without even getting into the moral and legal aspects, then there needs to be a really quite remarkable shift in strategy.
Thank you, Jade. So maybe I can come back to Mykola actually to cover this, to come back to this issue. I mean, it's clear there's a lot of frustration in Ukraine over the slow deliveries of Western weapons and in insufficient numbers. There's been a lot of conversations going on in the last weeks and days. I mean, including over the last few days with this the big summit that took place in Ukraine, of first ladies and gentlemen, when everybody seemed to be there. Do you see that there's a shift, that there's a better understanding of how quickly these weapons should be delivered immediately, or do you have concerns about a sort of still a lack of recognition of this? I mean, what's the big problem here?
You're asking me, yeah?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I said Mykola, sorry.
Got it. No problem, sorry. Well, what is obvious now, this long-range firepower dominates debate, but I like how Jade framed it, because people perceive war in mechanistic terms. So societies, countries in war, they are not a mechanism. They are not a clock you can oil, and it would function smoothly as in a day one. And that's a problem. So people perceive societies and countries in war mechanistically. And when we have Secretary of State we respect, and we really thank him for his contribution, especially to the insider debates, being a hawk, having the image of the hawk. But when he come to Kyiv and say, look, you've sustained it for 30 months. You can alleging that you can sustain it also for another 13 months. It doesn't work this way. And that's a problem. So people need to change this mechanistic understanding of war, especially when war is waged on your territory. When your country, your society is a battle space, being subjected to strikes. So what we see is that this debate is ongoing. We see this urgency. We see a lot of arguments. And I think finally we'll have this kind of solution. But how the whole situation is framed, I mean, this strategy is framed, the situation is perceived, it points to very negative, disturbing direction. And it's not about specific capability. Again, saying that you can't win a war with just one specific capability is also not right, because it's not an excuse to provide this capability, as it said. But it's something beyond this capability, because capability is just another fix, short-term fix. And the major problem is indeed a kind of strategy. What we don't see is a strategy, long-term balanced strategy in terms of goals, in terms of resources, in terms of sustained aid. Because otherwise, if we don't have this kind of things eventually, and that is the reason why President Zelensky wanted to present this victory plan in US quite soon, in a week or so. If we don't have this kind of strategy, then Russian hero victory is going to progress, is going to provide results, and then I don't want to speculate about the prospects, because it's only a terrible thing to discuss. So debate is ongoing, but the problem is not specific capability. The problem is that biggest things are missing. First and foremost, a clear-cut, resourced strategy that has a buy-in on both sides of the Atlantic, in both political parties in US, because otherwise it's just a crisis management which would have this Ukrainian stock of resiliency depleted. And again, I don't want to speculate what would happen next.
Yeah, the strategy certainly is as long as it takes, right? This is what Europeans and others say, we'll stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. But this isn't a strategy, it's just a slogan. Just to come back to what you mentioned about the victory plan, do you have any details of what's in that plan?
For obvious reasons, I don't have this kind of clearance.
Speculation over what could be in it then.
Let frame it different way. So sound strategy is about three things. You need to have a balanced triangle between political ends, economic and military means, and where you apply them. So we have a number of problems. The first problem is that US and Ukraine frame ultimate victory differently. Ukraine framed victory as a liberation of all territories, inflicting as much damage on Russian inter-service grouping of forces, and by this maybe creating conditions for Russian post-imperial transition and reassessment of their identity and their relations with Ukraine. US only said for certain 1 year that we want to have Ukraine democratic, economically and socially developed, with a deterrence effect, unlike on the 21st February 2022. And by this, you won't find any high-level quotes that would say we want to have Ukraine liberate all the territories. So US implicitly say that if Ukraine is preserved, even without some territories, and it can defend itself, then we are fine with this. So first we see this kind of difference, political one, and I don't know how we are going to bridge this kind of difference. Another difference is resources. Ukraine for 31 months said, West, our dear partners, you need finally to do military and economic mobilization on scale of World War I, World War II, Cold War. You talk about the richest, most sophisticated technological alliance, so what? Russia has more shells, more missiles. So please translate this latent power into actual power. We don't see this kind of things, unfortunately. We gained our partners 31 months. That's quite a big, 2.5 years, by standard of both world wars. The scale of military-industrial mobilization is lagging, unfortunately. That's true. And 2% of GDP now, it's not enough. And you have a difficulty of persuading your own citizens. In this, you a little bit remind me Ukrainians after original Russian attack. You have this back and forth psychological in your heads. What amount of GDP is enough? So Ukraine say, mobilize on the way of World War II. Where is the arsenal of democracy? It's missing. What our partners are hinting that Ukraine, you don't have unlimited access to resources. Please devise and implement your strategy with understanding that you would have some deficit of resources, which is natural, so adjust. And for sure, we have some military difficulties because war is evolving, the character of war is evolving, and adjustments are difficult. So we understand that World War II template is not working, but something else is still missing. So that's why in all three sides of this strategic triangle, we have some problems, real problems. And how we are going to bridge them, I don't know. But it is the way how I advise anyone to assess any hypothetical Ukrainian plan or any hypothetical Western plans.
Major General, do you see a way to bridge these gaps? And obviously, if the Democrats aren't re-elected in 5 weeks' time, the situation is going to become even more difficult and unpredictable, to say the least. What would be your insights on this?
Let me start with setting a bit of the strategic context, I think, here. I agree with very much of what Mykola has just said, and certainly I think the point that Jade made about the Ukrainian resilience and morale is a factor now that wasn't considered a critical support factor resource early on. It was considered almost taken for granted It was the reason why Ukraine was doing so well at resisting the initial invasion, and then able to give them the ability to push back in 2023. But what I would say is that first off, there is a strategy. It's not necessarily the one that most Ukrainian supporters and certainly Ukraine want, but what we've seen de facto, and I can't tell you what's actually been written, but certainly decisions to date, actions to date, point to the fact that the U.S. and its allies have agreed to constrain Russia, to limit Russia, to prevent them from achieving their objectives in that sort of defeat from taking over of Ukraine and ensuring that there will be an independent Ukraine after the fight inside Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. Now, that's not what we want. We want not as long as it takes. We want whatever it takes, and we've heard that over and over again as the right way forward. Unfortunately, and this is where I have to agree again with Mykola, is that the ways and means haven't been there. The ways in terms of the unrestricted use of weapon systems and supply to Ukraine, and certainly not the means in terms of the rate of production and the amount that's necessary. So I'm not sure that the West, as we've seen in terms of its struggle with providing the combat vehicles, the F-16s, the munitions and artillery over time, that they've had within their own stocks and their industrial base the capacity to provide what Ukraine needed to win to date. And they've made several attempts. We've certainly seen munitions production rates rise in the U.S., much slower in Europe. Initiatives, like the Czech one, to seek munitions elsewhere to provide Ukraine what it needs. But we have not seen the West respond at the level of what it would take to support a whatever it takes kind of a strategy. And I'm not sure that they're going to get there. So what that means is we've got to recalibrate and we've got to come up with a strategy that improves Ukraine's chances of survival, given the fact that manpower is not inexhaustible, that resilience is not inexhaustible. It's not a pool of reserve without depth. We see the impact on infrastructure. Probably some 50% of the energy infrastructure is not there now for the upcoming winter. That's going to create huge problems. From 12 hours of electricity that might be enjoyed right now to maybe 4 or 6 hours in the coming months. That's going to have a real impact on the suffering of Ukrainian citizens, and frankly, the morale, not only the civilians but the military. So that's an issue, and that has not yet been dealt with, I think, sufficiently by Western leadership. Now, coming back to the U.S. elections and the impact, I think we've seen very clear distinctions in policy approaches with Trump's "I want to stop the war" at whatever unassumed costs to Ukraine territorial integrity and sovereignty, et cetera. And then, a continued of as long as it takes kind of support from Harris. We don't know what a policy review might lead to post administrations. I was in the Trump administration as both a senior military and then a NATO diplomat, and I saw a very distinct difference between rhetoric and action. Action was much more positive, ally-friendly, ally-supportive than I would have managed. And although I'm not a Trump supporter, and I'll say that openly, I'm not so sure that what he says is actually what he would do, given the kinds of advisors he would bring on in a follow-on administration. But we have to be prepared for it. And so, that's a cautionary note that if Trump wins, we are certainly going to see hard times for Ukraine, and no guarantees that they'll be able to continue to negotiate from a position of strength. And so I think that we should certainly hope that Harris wins. There's a chance of continued assistance and perhaps even increased support to Ukraine with a Harris administration, not necessarily with a Trump administration.
Thanks, Skip. I have to say, after listening to the Trump-Harris debate, I don't feel, overconfident either in whether she's going to make a significant shift away from the policy of Biden vis-a-vis Ukraine. I mean, she certainly didn't call for a Ukrainian victory either during that debate, which was disappointing. But I want to come back to you, Jade. I want to talk about the Kursk operation in a moment, but I just want to continue on this issue of the slow delivery of Western assistance. It's very frustrating. I'm not a Ukrainian, but it makes me want to scream out loud, actually, because it's difficult to understand. Why do we still have this huge gap between narratives and actions and deliverables to Ukraine? I mean, it's still like dripping military assistance into the country bit by bit, which has been devastating for the Ukrainian military. I mean, the situation on the battlefield, and it seems we're going to go through the situation again now during the winter. I mean, what do you put this down to? I mean, why is there not more, I would say shamefacedness from some EU leaders in particular about the lack of deliverables and lack of progress in this domain?
So I think that's the key question. I think part of the reason is because the Major General was, of course, correct. There is a strategy, and the strategy is broadly the as long as it takes, i.e., to keep Ukraine in the fight. I think my worry is that I think that this strategy is incorrect, or I think that what this strategy is informed by is incorrect, in the sense that I think that it won't work, and I think that the pressures that it places across Ukraine are too much. And I think that it will eventually run out. I also agree that it's not likely, for all of the reasons both Major General and Mykola pointed out, that we can get to a joint victory strategy that's shared, which seems to suggest to me that rather urgently, given the state of the energy infrastructure in Ukraine, and the likely not just problems, but I think also we're going to be talking about outflows of refugees again during this winter. And I'm not sure that any European country is particularly keen to have further outflows of refugees, to put it mildly, right now. So I think that the energy aspect does add a sense of urgency. I think we need to focus then on an intermediate strategy, essentially of stopping the bleeding, of providing some form of safe haven. The only thing to me that would seem to be in any way workable, but I'm not an air defense expert, so there are certain aspects here that I can only really talk about the political kind of strategic element. But I think is having some form of bilaterally provided, so obviously it can't be provided by NATO, air defense over some of the critical infrastructure, perhaps over the western borders, because that could even have a de-escalatory effect, because right now, every time a missile goes into Polish or Romanian airspace, there's this kind of slight terror of, okay, well, what about if a missile gets shot down over NATO airspace by a NATO member? And then we get ourselves to the absolute obscene horror of having, countries almost escorting Russian missiles they can get back to kill Ukrainian civilians. I mean, this is not a tenable situation. It seems better to me that they get shot down over Ukrainian airspace, and I'm sure the Ukrainians wouldn't be against it. It also would then, you can do it gradually, you can move it further, to larger spaces, or perhaps to certain, areas, so that you could allow Ukraine to truly be able to start on its domestic production, small at first, but again, it would have to be very gradualized, have more training. It would be great for morale. A lot of the soldiers that I spoke to kind of about this idea in the East, even though clearly it wouldn't affect any territory in the East, they would clearly not come under any kind of safe haven space. They were keen because just the idea that somewhere would be safe, or that areas where their families could go would be safe, would be at least an improvement on the current situation, which a lot of them seem to worry will end up being kind of like a 2014 but worse, until Russia then invades again.
I mean, I agree with you about the safe havens, but there's been a lot of discussion about this. I'm not sure whether anything has been agreed concretely. I mean, particularly vis-a-vis Romania, Poland, but not only. Maybe you can shed some light on this as well, Mykola, whether you would see any progress towards achieving these sorts of safe havens in the near future. And then my follow-on question would be coming back to Ukraine's Kursk operation, which I think began on the 6th of August. Perhaps you could give us a sort of overview of the main let's say, achievements from that operation. I mean, remind us what the goals of that was, and where it's at the moment. I mean, if it is sustainable, etc.
With regards to the safe haven to sanctuaries, debate is ongoing. So they are back and forth. There are statements by Polish MFA heads that are in favor, and there are statements by NATO headquarters that do not favor this kind of thing. But we need to push this debate because it provides some advantages for Ukraine. And turning to the other part of the question with regards to Kursk, so in war, there are three dimensions. So physical, psychological, and political. And from this point of view, this Ukrainian action, risky one for obvious reasons, should be considered success for a number of things. So first, we get a lot of prisoners of war for exchanges, because we had this asymmetry when Russia doesn't want to exchange our prisoners of war, especially people who fight at Azov steel mill. Now we have two exchangers, big one, because we have these conscripts we captured and we observed their rights as prisoners of war. Second, we managed to drive Russian redeployment from a number of directions, because recall, Russia is not only fighting at Pokrovsk or Toretsk direction. There is also Kupiansk direction, Chasiv Yar direction, Zaporizhia region, Kherson region. And the Russians, they had to scramble resources all alone without, of course, deflecting resources from Pokrovsk direction, which is #1 priority. And by the way, with this, like forcing Russian redeployment plus making them pay a steep price for very small advances, we force on Russia another major decision: how you can sustain fighting in terms of manpower. Russia is on the verge of a very difficult decision, whether to mobilize or not. Because this system, when they try to engage people relying on thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars of subsidy provided, it's not working. So creating dilemmas for opponent, not only operational, but strategic and social, it's also an important kind of thing. And last but not the least, I think this operation was done in the context of the preparation for this unveiling of victory plan. And by this, we demonstrate that we still can fight, produce result, attain both operational tactical surprise. And also in this debate with regards to long-range firepower, because now the Kursk precedent is used extensively to say that Russians, they do not stick to the nuclear doctrine that say that violations of territorial integrity of nuclear armed superpower won't be left without any kind of special response. So I think this risky endeavor, it gained some benefits. For sure, it can turn the tide of the war on itself, because to turn the tide of the war, we need bigger forces. We don't have bigger, better supplied forces. Because ideally, this operation should have unfolded with the whole northern grouping of forces that is now conducting operation against Kharkiv region being enveloped. And then for sure, we might have turned the tides of the war decisively and managed to force this kind of redeployment people expect. But still, I would say that we boosted morale, we attained all the goals I described. And again, situation in east of Ukraine is difficult, and we might lose another bit of territory. But in itself, it's not a strategic end of the war. Because recall, 2 years ago, Severodonetsk was described as strategic. So Russia controlled Severodonetsk for 2 years. Yes, it was a great loss, but Ukraine continued to fight, Western continued to supply. The only problem is that Russia might try to turn these local successes into a big psychological boost against Ukraine and to play it in the information domain and to undermine people moral inside Ukraine and people moral outside Ukraine. But strictly speaking, well, Ukraine just continue, given the lack of the weaponry, to trade space for time, trade space for Russian unsustainable losses, with the hope that eventually Russia would accept that they can't move on. That's the only thing we are left with the current parameters of the Western strategy.
Thank you, Mykola. I mean, I agree that it was an ingenious move by Ukraine to go into Kursk. I mean, nobody was expecting that, and it certainly raised morale and many other things among Ukrainians, and not just Ukrainians actually. I think probably from the Western partners as well. But I'd like to get your take on this, Major General. I mean, particularly vis-a-vis, I mean, the Russian operations in eastern Ukraine, and what would it mean if they actually take Pokrovsk? I mean, would that be as I mean, Mykola, you sort of flagged that could not be. Maybe it wouldn't be such a major blow as many people are talking about. How do you see that? And also the situation in the south of the country, because there's always much more focus on the east of Ukraine than there is on the south. I mean, Russia doesn't seem to have redeployed many troops from either of these locations into Kursk. This also would signal that they're not that bothered about the Kursk region. But yeah, that's a different question. But I give the floor to you, Major General.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. I have to say that I agree, very broadly with what Mykola said. I would probably categorize some of those impacts slightly different. I tend to, rather than he's accurate in terms of political, psychological, and physical domains as being important in war. I tend to put them at the strategic, operational, and tactical level, where the strategic includes the political, and certainly the morale, et cetera. But to me, in the strategic level, the most important is that it has undermined, Putin's threat of, nuclear response for any incursion into Russian territory, or even use of allied weapon systems in Russia. It occurred, and it's not in accordance with with old Soviet or current Russian doctrine to use nuclear weapons when the threat of the state is not at risk. And so, yes, incursion would require a response, but most likely conventional missile, not nuclear, unless the very survival of the state was at risk, or of the regime. And so I think that's important, because one, it exposes yet again a fear that was unfounded, and as has been said both by Jade and Mykola, that's important for the way forward in the next steps by Western leaders. Next, it has been important for morale, military, civilian, from Ukraine point, and it's undermined, Russian morale, both the people of the Kursk region and, of course, the military leaders. They've lost initiative, and that's at the operational level. Ukraine's gained initiative. At the strategic level, it's put Putin on back foot. He's had to respond, and he's used very kind of a military response by using the FSB and others to try to figure out how he's going to organize a coherent response. And that's not necessarily working well. The counteroffensive have not gone on extremely well. It's required the military leadership to divert resources and attention, and both of those are important. Now, in terms of also the exchange of POWs, I think, as Mykola said, at the operational level, though, this loss of initiative is important, because it means that no longer can the military leadership be completely focused, cohesive on the fronts within Ukraine, and the little Kharkiv, continued offensive, which is very limited now and gets limited resources in terms of air, land support, and that's required them to figure out where can we pull away reserves and munition stockpiles, reroute them to sustain a counteroffensive in Kursk, and how fast can we gain that back? Now, they've been given a little bit of relief from Putin because he's downplayed the importance, and at least externally. Internally, I don't know if there's any less pressure on the Russian military leadership to regain that terrain as fast as possible, but they're not doing well, and certainly after 5 weeks, they're not gaining ground fast, and it's going to take them quite a bit of time. So operationally, it has diverted resources. We see mostly in terms of a few combat formations, combat tested, the VDV, the airborne troops, the Spetsnaz. That's important for offensives in the east. and of course munitions and air power. And so that's good. That's good for for Ukraine and good for Ukrainian troops defending in the east. Tactically, it's demonstrated once again, the capabilities, maneuver capabilities, targeting capabilities of Ukraine forces, and that's been good for them, and they're imposing losses at a greater rate to Russian forces, those defending, those counter attacking, and so that's good, and that's all good for the moment. How long can they sustain it? That's a big question, and I think that we can expect that the Ukraine political and military leadership are going to balance the gains against the losses to figure out when the time is right to allow for an organized withdrawal over time, and they're going to make it as costly as possible to the Russian forces, which I think is good, and that's going to require Russian defensive forces to remain there to prevent a further incursion, because that threat can will sustain. And so I think that overall it was a good move for Ukraine. Hadn't necessarily had the draining effect that they would have liked, but it's having an effect. In terms of Pokrovsk, and I think Mykola made the point that that's not the only effort of advance. It's certainly the main effort, and I think probably the one that would gain the most tactically for Russian troops in terms of control of the Donbass, and specifically Donetsk. It's not going to give them all Donetsk. They've still got a long way to go. In fact, they've still got a long way to get to Pokrovsk at the rate they're going, and which is a reduced rate because of the Kursk offensive. So it'll allow them to gain territory. That's going to be more territory under Russian control that they can eventually reinforce the defense and make it more difficult for the Ukrainian forces to retake. So it's going to be a loss, but I think that that's expected right now. It was probably expected faster before the Kursk incursion. And we'll see where things go. And Jade talked a little bit about the defense capacity of Ukraine. I focused on that 3 years as a diplomat with the developing the Ukraine's defense industry, both state concern and a private. That has been extremely innovative, and it's been a pleasure to see exactly how they've developed this innovative ecosystem to respond to Ukraine's needs. There's talk about a new ballistic missile, coming on board. They've certainly upped drone production. They've upped their own, vehicle and munitions production. So I think that's a good news story that will probably continue to, move forward. In terms of other areas, I'll finish here. Zaporizhia, Kherson, north into Luhansk. I don't think those efforts are going to get much support from Russia, because they don't see that as significant at the moment. They're going to focus on Donetsk, making progress there, and then they'll turn their focus elsewhere if they make the progress they wish in Donetsk.
Thanks, Skip. Just to the audience, you're being very passive. We have a lot of people tuned in, but nobody's asking any questions. So I would really urge you to put some questions, because I think the speakers would like to hear questions from other people rather than just myself. So we have the blue. So we still have 10 minutes to go, so please don't be shy. But I want to come to you, Jade, to get your take on the Kursk operation, but more commenting on the Russian response to this, because as we've already heard from Mykola and the Major General, it wasn't perhaps the response that we expected it to be. I mean, is it because Russia isn't prioritizing it? Is it because it doesn't have the capacity? Maybe you could also say something on this issue of conscription, and also about, internally in Russia, how it's been perceived. From these so-called Z bloggers, for example. What sort of impact are they having, if any at all?
Mm-hmm. Big question, thank you. So I don't have anything to add in terms of the advantages of the Kursk incursion. I think a lot has been said. I agree with it. And in any case, that both the other speakers are better placed than me to assess them anyway. But yes, in terms of inside Russia, I think originally there was a lot of expectations or perhaps mirror imaging from the West, where they expected the fact that there had been an incursion that had taken, you know, not a small amount of territory of the Russian Federation, that this would then kind of, you know, humiliate Putin or, you know, would cause some sort of internal turmoil in Russia, which seemed to me, as I kind of suggested, evidence of a continuing mirror imaging of how our societies would react, and therefore thinking that Russia would react in a similar way, or that Russian people would react in a similar way. We did see a slightly heightened kind of metric of anxiety, but I think it was sort of around the 4% mark. And if we compare that to September 2022 mobilization, that was around the 27% mark. So very manageable. In part, that's because of the state propaganda, because the state propaganda was very much pushing a not really anything to see here message. Clearly, as you sort of referred to, the Z bloggers and on Telegram, you were able to get a much more, well, very different picture. And you did have a number of almost like online fights emerging between state propagandists like Solovyov and some of the Z bloggers, including a very well-known Z blogger account called Two Majors, because the state propagandists were accusing the Z blogger propagandists of demoralizing the Russian people by basically being honest, or at least more honest about what's happening in Kursk. But I would say the vast majority of people probably spend less time in Russia, probably spend less time than I do reading these blogger accounts, though they are very popular. But they represent a very entrenched, very, you know, vocally, virulently pro-war group. They're a minority, but I think they're an interesting minority, and we should probably pay more attention to them, because they are one of the few groups, possibly the only group, that can play the patriotism card back against the elites. So they're not nice people. One wouldn't want to vote for them, but they can have a real destabilizing effect. The most obvious examples of which were seen with Prigozhin. We're not going to see another Prigozhin. He's really one of a kind. But they could still have an effect, especially if we think about if there is a period where Russia, whatever reason, is willing to consider good faith negotiations, i.e. negotiations that it actually intends as negotiations, they could prove a real thorn in the side of any leadership there, because they are virulently, in general, have been virulently against negotiations. Recently, they've been starting to ask, what is the point? And are we going to lose our own territory in order to take what is somebody else's territory? So there are also interesting shifts going on there. So perhaps that could change. But most of the population is not like the Z bloggers. Most of the population is broadly acquiescent, going to go along with the war for lots of different reasons, involving broad kind of mythology around it, you know, propaganda of hate against Ukrainians, repressive domestic environment, not really in their interests, even if they didn't agree with the war. And I think that the focus needs to be on the domestic. We've been speaking about Ukraine's domestic kind of socio-political resilience as a resource in this war. And there really isn't enough discussion or study, I would say, though it's improving, of Russia's own domestic socio-political resilience. And that also needs to be considered as a resource in this war, and I think dealt with more in a more sophisticated manner than perhaps sometimes we are. Though, like I say, improvements are happening.
That's a good topic for a new research paper then, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we just have a few minutes left, and I still don't see that any of our guests have come with a question, so we must be covering everything that they want to hear. So I want to come back to you, Mykola, actually, to ask about the recent attack on the vessel in the Black Sea. What more do you think can be done to protect or to strengthen Black Sea security? I mean, it was I think a Turkish vessel carrying grain, so it's actually undermining, you know, international food security. So should there be more focus again placed on shoring up Black Sea security, and how would that be done?
As for me, everything that is related to maritime domain is a good reminder that without Crimea being at least demilitarized fully, there would be no security, and Black Sea demilitarized fully was deprived of Russian military capability, there would be no security. Otherwise, it's a good example that Russia would never reconcile with a free flow of goods. because they understand that Ukrainian viability is at stake, economic viability, and every other dimension of viability. And for sometimes there were no such attacks, and we see that Russians, they don't cease to find this as an opportunity to interfere. So we shouldn't take for granted the fact that for almost a year we had this viable corridor, and we should be prepared for other Russian unconventional responses, including eventually Russia might field the same unmanned surface vehicles and try to use them to interdict the shipment of grain, iron ore, and all other things. So the most important thing out of this is that we shouldn't take it for granted, and we should prepare for any other kind of contingencies, and only further demilitarization and degrading of Russian military capability is the only solution for ensuring freedom of navigation in the Black Sea.
Thank you. I see at the very last minute, two people have come with comments. From Dmitro Shurko, he's asking how you see the future of the Russian areas conquered by Ukraine now. As many people there have seen the difference between Moscow propaganda and reality, do you expect it could trigger any internal changes in Russia? Is that likely in any which way?
I don't think so on the current scale that it is, and I think that in some ways it's not just about propaganda of kind of seeing the reality. Often propaganda is built on really quite ingrained like worldviews and ways of seeing the world, you know, that narratives have to resonate with. So and that, you know, make it easier to not see unhelpful facts. So I think it'd be more complicated than that, unfortunately.
We have two other questions here that I will quickly put. From Jonathan Fink, who's asking about the supply by Iran and North Korea of missiles to Russia. How will this affect the soft appeasement strategy regarding permissions to use storm shadows, etc., and the accusation China is far more active in sustaining the Russian war machine? I mean, I would add to that, is there any way we could actually stop Iran from sending missiles with perhaps more sanctions? I don't know who would like to take that. And then from Anonymous, they're asking, what's the worst case scenario for the further development of the war? So perhaps I'll let you all take the floor one more time, and then we can wrap it up. So I'll come back to you first, Mykola, then to you, Major General, then to you, Jade.
Two short answers. First, the supply of missiles out of Iran and North Korea make US position is more untenable. So it's more and more difficult to defend this position when Russia has different sources of missiles and Ukraine is deprived of missiles to target strictly military targets. About worst case scenario, well, Russia is pursuing holistic strategy. They combine military and non-military means. They want to undermine Ukrainian moral. They want to undermine moral outside Ukraine. And they want to exploit local successes to sustain this dynamics that favors them right now. So if we don't stop this dynamics, then two consensuses would unravel to the point when the Russian negotiation position is strengthened to the extent that they would ask not only for some territorial concessions, but maybe for a limited number of Ukrainian armed forces, limited capability. So that's the worst case scenario for me.
Thank you, Mykola. I'll come to you now, Major General.
So I would agree with Mykola on the fact that you know, the shipment of Iranian missiles, just like the shipment of vast amounts of munitions from North Korea, have you know, demonstrated, one, Russia's need for its own type of allied support to sustain its aggression, and has, you know, undermined the limits and restrictions that the Western nations are imposing on their combat systems and munitions. So I think that's important. We haven't yet seen proof of Iranian ballistic missiles being used, and they've been reported as early as April, hundreds of the longer range ballistic missiles being shipped, and then now the shorter range, about 300s and so 360s. But nonetheless, I think once they were used, that would be again munition in political mission in in Zelensky's bag to ask for lifting of restraints. I think that, frankly, I think we'll get the lifting of restrictions before we see that happen. With respect to worst case scenario, I have to agree. Any scenario that leaves Ukraine hobbled territorially, militarily, or even politically in terms of orientation towards the EU and NATO would be, for me, a worst case scenario.
I'll very quickly go on the worst case scenario. I think the worst case scenario is that Russia achieves anything close to its sort of stated goals, whether that's destroying Ukrainian sovereignty, not necessarily like through just military means, but through its slow bleeding out, and then using kind of more hybrid methods, perhaps after a ceasefire, to undermine its political cohesion, after which point it will feel justified in its sense that, you know, a new world order is emerging. Russia has a great power status, and it will, I would suggest, is very or highly likely to then start probing the security of Article 5 through semi-deniable operations in certain areas in Eastern Europe.
Thank you, Jade. I think we need to apply the slogan that was just mentioned in one of the questions by Jonathan Wank, Russia must lose slogan. We need to adopt that instead of as long as it takes, because this is really the right strategy. But we've run out of time. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today and giving us some really great insights onto the current situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think it's, you know, clear as crystal what the conclusion is. The conclusion is that the West needs to really do everything to support Ukraine and beat Russia and push Russia back. I mean, we need to properly support a Ukrainian victory, and this means first and foremost delivering the arms and lifting all restrictions and forgetting about all red lines. So thank you again for coming and sharing your views. The EPC will continue to work extensively on Ukraine. Actually, in 1 hour, we have a meeting downstairs in person with Ola Stefanisia, who's in Brussels today, to talk about Ukraine's EU accession journey, which is another topic, but also very important and super interesting, with many things going on. So to the audience, please keep an eye on our website to check other events. To all of our speakers today, many thanks again, and I look forward to welcome you again at a future EPC event. And the final word, of course, goes to Ukraine. Slava Ukraine. Thank you.
Героям слава.
Slava.
Good answer.